Okay, we'll go ahead and gather towards our seats again. If you want to top off your coffee real quick, we can do that. Unless it's still percolating. Looks like we had to make some more, so. Then we'll go ahead and get started here with Rick.
Every other year, yeah.
Is it coming up this year? Or was it last year? Was in Seattle.
Last year was down in North Carolina. This year, it's going to be up in Minnesota, Minneapolis the next time.
Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. I know a couple people will be trickling back in and finding their seats. But we'll, if we wait for every farmer to get done talking, we're here all day, right? So I don't want to be the guy that interrupts, but I guess I have to be. So, you plan events. This is how it works. Actually, I heard on the radio this morning that event planner is the third most stressful job, right? Which shocked me, right? I was after military and air traffic controller and event planner. Event coordinator or something like that. Anyway, whatever. So, next speaker is Rick Koelsch. He's a specialist with Extension, but also in the department of bioengineering, I think, is biosystems engineering. So he does a lot of work in manure. I think he was the old poop man. Is that what they called you?
Mr. Manure.
Mr. Manure. Sorry,
yeah, that sounds better.
That sounds a little more sophisticated than Poop Man. Sorry. Yeah. So he does a lot of work with manure and using that using the nutrients to your advantage. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to Rick. Thanks for coming, and again, feel free to jump in with questions if you have those. So
I don't need to use that. This is all I need. Okay.
As long as your green light's on here.
Okay. I think I got it on. All right, well, good morning, folks, ladies and gentlemen. Enjoy the opportunity to be with you here for the next 45 minutes and have a little bit of discussion around this topic. Although I kind of worry about the people I see that come to listen to a discussion of manure. You have to question, are your social opportunities that limited that this is the best you could do for the morning? I don't know. We may have to think about, rather than discussions on manure, maybe social skills for folks that are here in the room. I don't know. So anyway, thank you for being here with me today. And we're going to have a discussion around this topic. Historically, the things I've visited with, that I'm going to visit about today, we tend to deal with more of those folks that are the owners of the animals and dealing with the manure from that end. But Amy and I and others have been talking about really the solutions to making these larger livestock operations sustainable environmentally is going to be very much dependent on their neighboring crop producers. So today I'd like to visit with you folks, and I assume most of you are looking at this from a crop producer's perspective. Are there situations where that pile of manure there has economic value to you? And if there are, what are the fields where that would benefit the most? Looking through those fields that Aaron shared on that blue sheet with the different characteristics, it's important to scan some of your fields, I think, and decide which of those fields are really going to benefit the greatest. And so we're going to try to give you a few hints along that line today. So that's the intent. I thought I would start off, though, with a really important fact here. And this is a fact that got Mr. Trump in hot water yesterday, is my understanding, some of the comments he made. But the origin of this word that I sometimes misuse, hopefully not around my grandkids, although I've gotten called on that before. And this story starts back in the 1600s, 1700s. And in Europe, manure was regularly traded around Europe. It had value, pretty significant value to people at that time. They would put it on ships because it's bulky. You got to move a large quantity distances and ship it to different places that needed the nutrients and the organic matter. Well, the story goes that often when they were transporting this manure, the captain would send one of the crew down to the hold to check out the hold with their little lantern. And some of those ships leaked a little bit on occasions. Manure would get wet. And what does manure produce when it gets wet? A little methane gas, and boom, we'd blow up a few ships. Well, in order to prevent that from happening, they began putting on these containers, stow high in transport. And some suggest that's the origin of the word SHIT. So one of those important facts that you need to have in your back pocket for moving forward today. Okay. Well, let's get on to something a little bit more serious here today. My objectives here. I hope to do three things, but I want to ask you which of these are most important to you. So, and I want to make sure we answer your questions first before I do the things that I wanted to share. So my thoughts were to speak in terms of three items. One is, what's your role relative to that animal feeding operation? And this is an operation some of you may even know. It sets up there near Memphis, between Memphis and Ashland. The Rakes family probably know them. They've got a couple of medium-sized feedlots up in that area. And they've been very kind to me in helping serve as a case studies for a class that I teach on campus. So I'm going to use their What are the fields around that operation where there are some really significant win-win opportunities for using manure? And then what are those win-wins? Talk a little bit about some of the challenges. Manure is like everything else. There's not all black and white. There are challenges that come with it, and how do we avoid those? But I really feel like I need to answer your questions today. What's most important to you? So why are you here? What is it you wanted to hear from me that would be helpful? Some of the things you might be thinking about. Maybe let me start. Have any of you used manure? 1, 2, 3, okay, a few of you. All right. Any of you, I assume most of you are crop producers, is that correct? Not livestock? What was that? Oh, you okay. And not livestock producers, is that correct? You're a little bit of both, okay. All right. What would be the things you want to learn today? Questions you have? Salt concerns, okay. All right. Is it cost effective? Net return, okay. Did I hear one? Yes. Okay. 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 A number of questions related to the swine manure. Okay. Okay. All right. Yes. Nutrient what? Accuracy. Okay. All right. That was a good starting point, and feel free, today I want you to interrupt me at any time, and I'll go through some thoughts, and I'll make sure as we go through these, we'll touch on these. There's a couple of them I hadn't planned on touching on, but we'll make sure that before we're out of here that we've touched on those topics today, okay? Anything else you want to add up here before we get started? Okay. Okay. Excellent questions. So let's start with a few thoughts, and we'll make sure I turn to those, or stop me if I'm not addressing them when I'm saying a few things from the slides here. Okay. Where I wanted to start today is to get you thinking in terms of your role connected to that animal feeding operation. I will make the bottom line, I'll make the point that if our crop farms aren't connected to many of our animal feeding operations in some way, they're not going to succeed environmentally. And that goes for probably many, if not most, of the operations we have here in Nebraska. So the importance of building that relationship. Now, you have to figure that out if you're going to do that with a livestock operation, but what I'm going to share with you is the importance of that. And I like to use this in another slide here in a second to share that. This is a map of the United States, and it shows where there is more phosphorus in the manures being produced on a county basis versus cropland available to use this. Okay, and that's the blue areas, and then some of the other colors are counties that are getting close to that, all right? So you can see where the livestock industry has located. You can see in North Carolina, the swine industry, across the South, the poultry industry, Wisconsin, California, Washington's the dairy industry, Texas, Western Kansas, you see the beef industry where it's concentrated in those areas. Now, in those areas of the country, manure is actually a waste product. And I hate to use that word because I think it's the wrong word to use with manure. But it is a waste product. And the reason is, essentially, this is the system we've created. We have mined phosphorus from Florida. We ship it to the Corn Belt. We grow the corn in the Corn Belt. We ship it to these areas of high concentration. And then there is no place for that manure phosphorus to go in those regions. That is when manure is a waste. And the eastern shore of Maryland is a great example. A lot of poultry operations, not near enough land to use that. And biological systems, as a general rule, have to form some kind of a closed loop, a complete recycling to function effectively. And we've created biological systems in our agriculture that aren't closed loop systems. And that is one of the biggest reasons we have environmental issues that are associated with livestock. Now, you can probably pick out Nebraska up there. I don't know if I did highlight it. And we know we have a lot of cattle and some other livestock here in Nebraska, but we also have the ability to recycle those nutrients. And in Nebraska, I would say I would never term manure to be a waste product. It is a resource, a product that we need to value. And if we don't value it, then it becomes an environmental problem. So I'm going to go back to the rakes operation here. And they have to manage their manure so that Memphis Lake here and Wahoo Creek that runs through here are not impacted. So when I sit down with a family like the Rakes, and I ask them to kind of draw a line or a boundary around their farming operation, including their crops, their livestock, and I start talking with them about how does phosphorus enter this operation. And this is the way it comes in. These three forms are the most common: animals, feed, fertilizer. And how does it leave? It generally leaves at animals. Rakes sell a few soybeans, but mostly the phosphorus leaves as animal. And for that farm to be environmentally sustainable, they need to be able to add these three arrows up, balance it against this arrow that leaves. And if that imbalance is a large number, then I got a problem. Wahoo Creek here has a problem. So that is the challenge they're dealing with. Now, within this operation, they're recycling phosphorus all the time, aren't they? They're growing grains, growing forages that they need for the cattle, using the manure to grow as part of the nutrients. So there is a recycling. These are important flows because how efficiently I use this manure determines the size of this fertilizer arrow. How efficiently I produce these feed grains determines the size of the feed I have to feed arrow, how much feed I have to purchase. And so historically, what we've done with these farms is ask them to monitor very carefully that flow of nutrients in the manure and adjust their fertilizer purchases accordingly. And that's really the foundation of the regulations that we have here in Nebraska and across the country. Now, this approach works, and that approach is meant to create this balance, these arrows on the left with these arrows on the right. Okay. That approach works with farms in the beef operation that grow 80% of their feed or more. If they start buying more than 20% of their corn, their soybean meal, their hay from off-farm sources, this system doesn't work any longer. We begin to overwhelm this recycling of manure within the farm. And so those farms that are buying most of their feeds, large feed input, their only option to keep this sustainable is to export manure. Now, that's not a regulated requirement, but to remain sustainable, to keep Wahoo Creek from turning green every summer and Memphis Lake from turning green every summer, that's what they're going to have to do. And that's where you become involved in this. So I'm trying to suggest that you are important to the environmental functioning of this operation, and if we're going to be able to keep it here in Nebraska. All right. So the last thing I wanted to share with you, and then we'll get on to some more practical discussion here, but there is a fundamental principle for protecting the environment from nitrogen and phosphorus. I think that's a principle that you've used in many other places, and that principle is we need to use local nutrients, whether that be manure, whether that be nitrates that are in the irrigation water, whether that be residual nitrogen in our soils from last year. We need to account for those, utilize those before we ship nitrogen and phosphorus from Florida or from the Gulf Coast or places such as that. To avoid overwhelming this watershed with extra nitrogen and phosphorus, we use what we have locally first. So what I'm trying to leave you with is that you are connected to the success, the environmental success of this operation. And hopefully we can establish the relationships between some of you and this operation or others that you're nearby that allow that to be true. Okay. So that's kind of a little bit of philosophy and the important role that you play in this recycling process. But now I think we need to get to some more of the practical questions, such as the questions you folks raised over there. Any comments or anything about what I've just shared before we move on? Questions? Did that make sense to you? Did it? Yes. Mm-hmm. Okay. And you'd like to have a little bit of information about that? Okay. All right. And there'll be some bits and pieces where I'll talk a little bit about that. And so stop me at different places and let's see if we make sure we're addressing your question. Okay. Now, I want to talk in terms of, for the rest of the day, about what is manure worth? How do we give it its greatest value? What are the fields that benefit the most from this? Okay. If you were to assign value to the manure that you've used, and we've met before and I can't remember your name, I'm sorry. Larry, that's right. Larry, what would be the things you would list up here as value? Okay. Okay. So replacing the. Okay. So one thing up here should be substitution for my commercial fertilizer bill. Okay. Great. Anything else ought to go up here? You're interested in the biology, the soil health. Okay. Anybody? Improvement of the soils, so the value of that soil or the quality of the soil. Yep. Organic matter, and there, that's all getting connected here. Anything else? Okay. How do we want to incorporate that into a no-till? And I think we're going to address that a little bit. It's probably not one of the things I put on the list, but I guess that's dealing with those kind of the headaches that come with manure, and how do we avoid some of those. Okay. Well, I threw these three things up here. Larry, is yield any different when you substitute? You can take value for that. Why? You do. So you think there is a yield gain? Okay. So I may use you as my salesman here today rather than me. Well, I tend to look at these three topic areas and try to figure out in an individual field, is there going to be a benefit from these three areas? And so that's where I'm going to put most of my discussion. We'll kind of watch if we cover those things over there. Okay. So, oh, somebody shared this with me. I don't know if any of you have worked with Andy Schulting. He's a West Point Nutrient Advisors. And this was an Iowa State publication from 1907. And take a look just at a few of the kind of the key words here that I think they'll show up in a second. Manure is the most effective means of permanently improving the soil, and it goes into other information down below about that. One of my best memories of my father and my grandfather, who were both farmers early in our family, was the day my dad decided to sell the cattle. And that was probably the biggest argument I ever saw between the two, because I think my grandfather had some understanding of this and the value of that manure. And of course, this was back in the late 50s when we were moving more and more to commercial fertilizer. And my dad, being the new kid on the block, probably was pushing things a little bit too much at that time. But I think we've somehow, in my generation and my dad's generation, we forgot this lesson. We forgot how to value manure in many cases. And this is something that some of our ancestors have recognized. And I think in today's environment, we need to look at this closely. So I'm going to use this little article, this science article, to share with you just a quick summary of the science and what that tells us about changes that occur when we use manure to substitute for fertilizer. And this is a review that was done of 141 different studies all around the world. And I'll just pull out some things that are relevant to our corn production systems here. The first thing, of all of those 141 studies, on average, there was a yield increase of about 5%. And I think there's a lot of variability in this number. A lot of it depends upon the soils that you're working with to start with and the conditions. But on average, there's a small yield boost. Is that significant enough to get you to transport manure very far? Well, we'll look at that question here in a second. Another thing that I think we're less aware of is that when we replace fertilizer with manure, there is less loss of nitrogen into the environment, less loss of ammonia into the air, less loss of nitrates to the groundwater and to the surface water. How many would have thought that to be true with manure? A couple of you would. Some of you do. Well, that is true. There's 2 or 3 different reasons. We're not going to go into in great detail about that, but that is. Have you ever talked with a county commissioner or a zoning board member? Manure protects the environment, doesn't hurt the environment if it's used right. I don't think many of us have had that conversation. That conversation tends to get flipped the other way, and people tend to curse the manure's use. But there is a benefit that these 141 studies showed. A lot of it related to the pool of nitrogen. This is the soil pool here. That pool of nitrogen grows, but most of that nitrogen is added as what is called microbial biomass nitrogen, stored in the microbes that are very active in a field that has been manured. And that is a very stable form of nitrogen. It doesn't leak to the groundwater. It doesn't leak to the surface water. And that's part of the reason for these negative numbers in terms of soil or in terms of nitrogen loss. And then we would expect some changes over here on the soil side of it, the soil pool, an increase in the soil organic matter and the microbial biomass carbon, 42%, is where most of that nitrogen or phosphorus is, carbon is being stored. So this summarizes a few of those advantages that the science would tell us about. Now let's spend a little more time with some of these particular issues. Okay. From the fertility side, Aaron's led us through a discussion of the importance of all of these and some of the places where we need those. We're going to take these three nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and a couple of the micronutrients, and try to put a dollar value on this for you. Okay, well, I think I'll just skip by this for time. Okay, I'll start with a feedlot example here. Feedlot manure, such as from the rakes operation. In fact, this may even be data from their operation. I would put a lower value estimate of this at $14 a ton, based upon the soil or manure analysis that we had from that. And look how that gets divided up. Larry, you said phosphorus was the most important thing, what you looked at, and in this example, you can see that really stands out. I also put a higher value on it, and this was in a field that would need potassium. So number one was just based upon 2017 fertilizer cost. I keep losing my cursor. Is it up there? Oh, there it is. Okay. So this would be just based upon these nutrients. And then I asked what would be a higher end value, and then for this situation, I said the field has value in potassium. So that was a big jump in it. And then I also added a 5% yield increase in this example, but that's only a small slice of the pie. So in this example, phosphorus is probably the first thing you'd want to look at. What field needs phosphorus? And next I would start looking at what fields need potassium. And I'd probably look at those long before I'd look at the nitrogen value in that manure. Okay? So, which fields should I target? That's where I would, if I was dealing with the feedlot, that's where I would look first. And if I can make good use of those two nutrients, you know, that might be anywhere from almost 2/3 to 3/4 of the value of that potential value of that manure. All right. Make sense? Questions? Okay. Now, the gentleman over there next to you, Larry, asked about poultry manure. A couple different kinds of poultry manure. I got an example here for broiler litter. I'm guessing you're grabbing it from some of the egg operations down in the Firth area. Is that right? Or okay, so this may not answer your question. This is going to be broiler litter, like the facilities that are going on around the Fremont area and stretching down into this area with Costco. And I think we have a few of those. We have Smart Chicken. We have a few producers here east of Lincoln that I know of at least. So if you were getting broiler litter, again, phosphorus is the big value in that manure. If I need potassium, combination of phosphorus and potassium is the big value. There is some organic nitrogen in there, but it's probably 1/4 or less. So You start by looking for the fields that need the phosphorus and the potassium, right? Okay, pretty simple thing to figure out. All right. Now there are cases, these are both examples of dry manures. And in dry manures like these two, we lose most of the ammonium that the animal excreted. The animal generally excretes roughly half of the nitrogen as an organic form in the feces and roughly the other half in the urine as urea, and that it turns into an ammonium form pretty quickly. So we lose that ammonium form in these kinds of manure. But in our slurry manures, our dairy slurries, our swine slurries, we see an example more like this. The nitrogen value becomes more important for those manures. And so now we're wanting to look not only at the phosphorus, possibly the potassium, but we want to think in terms of that, can we capture that ammonium nitrogen? Can we get value out of that? So for our slurry manures, that becomes the most important. Okay. Questions as I'm going through? Speak up, stop me at any time. Yes. These were based upon fertilizer prices for last year. Okay, of commercial fertilizer, if I was to replace each of those nutrients that are shown there, and my field used all of those nutrients. Now, if my field was, let's say, high in potassium, and then I'd look at the example on the left, I wouldn't look at the example on the right, as an example. Okay. So it assumes your field are going to use those nutrients in some way. All right. So in this case, we're still targeting the fields that need phosphorus, but now we need to think in terms of that nitrogen and that ammonium nitrogen. And in order to gain that value, we need to incorporate that almost immediately. If we can inject it directly into the soil when we apply it, that's the best way of capturing most of that ammonium nitrogen. And of course, we're going to want to use it ahead of a crop, a non-legume crop that has a nitrogen demand that you're going to buy, you would have normally been buying nitrogen fertilizer for. So if we're dealing with slurry manures, we'll probably want to think both in terms of the phosphorus and the potassium, and the nitrogen. All right. I haven't even, we're going to get to that if you'll hold it, that is important. But you might, if any of these manures are something you might have access to, you might kind of remember those. We had 19 and 40 for the swine manure. Let's see if I want to go back. We had 35 and 58 per ton for the broiler litter. That's a drier product generally. For a feedlot, it was 14 and 28, low and high end. So kind of keep that in the back of your mind, and we'll compare that to some of the cost here in a second. Okay. All right. So let's just wrap up this discussion. I think this is pretty obvious information, but just give us a quick reminder. If we want to achieve a win from the fertility side of it, the fertility benefit, we're going to target those fields that are low in phosphorus, less than 20 part per million. I think we generally quit recommending phosphorus on fields less than 15 part per million. So somewhere in that range. We want to, when we deliver manure, it's often difficult to put it on at a rate just to meet 1 or 2 years of phosphorus. And so you generally are going to be in a strategy where you bank phosphorus for several years and use it over that, and not return to that same field with manure over the next several years as you consume that phosphorus. So monitoring the soil P levels to see when that field has come back down to that 15, 20 range, and then it may be time to reapply manure. That's how you get the greatest value. You also might think in terms of if you do any wheat production, those are fields that generally we need a higher phosphorus level. I think Aaron suggested 25 part per million. My number might be just a little high. But if you need to raise some fields up to that 25, 30 part per million for wheat production, manure can be an effective source of doing that fairly economically. So those are some situations where you get the greatest value. Potassium, we've mentioned that if you've got fields that are showing a need for potassium, excellent source, potassium in most manures. A corn crop, 200 bushel corn crop, pulls out about 265 pounds of potassium in a year. So our high yielding crops are demanding a lot of potassium. Is that all going to become available through your soil, or do we need to supplement? The question you need to ask. And then nitrogen, certainly we're going to want to conserve that ammonium nitrogen in our slurry manures, and we're going to want to apply any manures ahead of a non-legume crop in order to get the peak value, peak dollar value out of that manure. So that's a few things just to kind of keep in the back of your mind. All right. Any questions about fertility here? Let's see. We've got some information on the dollar value. We're going to get to that in a second. This may have answered a question or two about the value of the swine, but I'm sure you got other questions about that. Let's hang on to that. Nutrients. I kind of skipped by the slide that showed the nutrients. I think there's an example in there. The one thing I would think you always want to do when you're dealing with a animal feeding operation is talk with them directly about the characteristics of their individual manures. Manures vary so dramatically in nutrient quality. What the rakes harvest in terms of the spring versus the fall can be very different manures, even off the same lot, because of the environmental conditions and the amount of soil that gets mixed in and things such as that. All manures shift from time to time. So you need to get analysis for individuals, but all manures are going to have sources of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and many, if not most, of the micronutrients you need, such as the sulfur and zinc that Aaron was mentioning earlier. Okay, so we're starting to answer a few of these questions, and please stop me if you want to spell out some more on any of these. Right. What I thought I'd do next is talk in terms of Aaron's interest here, the more the soil quality, the soil productivity, or the term that's being used more and more, the soil health. And I think this is probably one of the messages about manure that has been forgotten more than anyone. I think we've often recognized the nutrient value, but there is some real value in terms of soil performance, productivity, that we often don't recognize. It's hard to put a dollar value. I'm not going to be able to give you $1 per ton for any of these things we're talking about. But there is changes in the soil physical characteristics and what an area I understand even less, the soil biological characteristics. But we'll try to share just a few things about these here. Watch my time. Okay. If you want to do any reading on this topic, this is a really nice summary that was done by Michigan State authors, and I reference it at the very last slide in what I shared with you today. But it talks about the benefits of manure to the soil quality. And one of the statements it makes in here is when manure is added to the soil, it is quickly colonized, and it, meaning the soil, is quickly colonized by millions of bacteria. Bacteria producing large quantities of polysaccharides. These polysaccharides function like sticky glue in the soil. It can actually stick particles together into aggregates. Now, one of the first things I think most soil scientists would always tell us is the quality of a soil is dependent upon the degree of aggregation. And I think we've all seen those soils that first time it gets hit by rain, the surface seals over, we get a nice hard top to it, and a lot of that water runs off. The soil aggregates are extremely important for encouraging infiltration of moisture into our soils. And so manure is providing carbon, an energy source, and also some additional bacteria, but really feeding the bacteria in the soil that allow it to perform this aggregation function. And we're going to see this through a number of slides here in just a second. So this is kind of a brief summary of what happens. That manure eventually is causing those soil aggregates. And the real benefit of that is in terms of these properties. greater soil infiltration of that rainfall event, less runoff, less erosion. And a few minutes ago, we were talking about the environmental benefits of manure. Well, the runoff, lower runoff, the lower erosion are additional benefits, environmental benefits to the use of that manure. Okay. So these are some of the physical property changes that you'll see. And I'm going to just share a little bit of some take-home messages from 2 research projects here in eastern Nebraska. This is some work. Some of you may know Charlie Wortman and Charlie Shapiro, a couple of soil scientists here at the university. They have done work at 4 sites with 3 manures and comparing the size of the aggregates in the soil and relative size of this, what they call a macro aggregate. And the 3 conclusions they took from this: all manures increase macro aggregates. So, and it didn't seem to make a whole lot of difference whether it's swine manure, beef manure, or even composted beef manure. They all 3 function pretty much the same. Those aggregates form very quickly. In fact, they saw that those aggregates formed within 2 weeks after the manure was applied, and they persisted throughout the growing season. So this is a change that occurs in that soil property very quickly and persist. And the other thing they saw is that more of the phosphorus in that soil was attached to those aggregates, and those aggregates are much less erodible, and so that phosphorus tends to be a little bit more resistant to runoff. So this demonstrates some of that change in those macro aggregates, but that seems to be an experience that you would see with just about any manure. It doesn't need to be one type versus another. Another piece of work that Charlie Wortman did in Mead, Nebraska, is he set up these plots in which they collected all the erosion and the runoff over an 8-year period. And some really interesting things that came out of this study. I'd just like to highlight 1 or 2 things. During the 3 years after which manure is applied, and this was beef compost manure applied ahead of the corn soybean rotation, and it was applied every year, the results they saw in terms of the erosion, I keep losing my cursor here. I just that blind here. Oh, it's just not showing up here. Okay. Up there on the top, the soil erosion, the left-hand bar shows what the erosion for the compost site, and then the right-hand bar showing the commercially fertilized site. And then the runoff is below it, the same thing. Notice that the erosion and the runoff from the composted site was about 30% to 40% of the erosion and runoff from the non-manured site, the fertilized site. So significant difference in terms of moisture that did not get into the soil in those 2 locations. So how does that impact you? Well, that's additional moisture in the soil for that July-August period when we sometimes run short on moisture. It's also benefits our neighbors downstream in terms of less soil in the creeks, less runoff, and the things that it would carry with it being in the creeks. So that's the benefit, the 3 years that they applied the manure. And then I think what was even more interesting was the 4 cropping seasons after they quit applying manure. And you can still see the soil erosion was less for those following 4 years. So there was a residual effect, a residual benefit of that manure for at least those 4 years, both in terms of erosion and runoff. So something that may not put a whole lot of dollars in your pocket unless that couple inches of rainfall that didn't move into the soil helps you out in August. So some years it may, some years you may get nothing out of that. But certainly also a benefit to the environment. Okay. This is just some yield data. They saw slight bumps in yield. I'm not going to spend any time with that. Similar to that 5% level that we talked about earlier. One other benefit that they saw in terms of soil properties look at the compost versus the no compost. Composted site, the manured sites were higher. And that probably isn't true with all manures. That probably is a feature of beef cattle manure in particular. I doubt that we would see that with the poultry manures or the swine manures. But with beef manure, most operations are feeding some limestone, right? Yeah. Excellent question. Let me finish this slide and we'll come right to that. But anyway, notice that improvement from those 3 years of manure application in the pH, which has some benefit to you. The reason for the beef manure having this advantage is that we feed probably a half a pound of limestone per cow per finished animal per day. So there is limestone in that manure. Some of it, that limestone value has been used in the gut of the animal to deal with the high use of corn in those diets. But a lot of that limestone comes out the back end. And so there is a benefit that we saw in terms of pH. Now, in terms of poultry manures or dry manures, we probably don't see a benefit, but we don't see much change or reduction in pH with those. With our high ammonium manures like swine manure, you'll probably see over time similar effects as if you were using anhydrous ammonia. Because anhydrous ammonia, the ammonium form of that is always detrimental to pH. So this is a situation that we see primarily with the beef manure. Okay. Now, back to your question, sir. How do we know the value or the concentration of nutrients in that? The only way to know that for sure is ask them to provide you a representative manure analysis of a sample that they took, and take that sample from the time of the year that manure was harvested that you're getting, because there is variation through the year. So every animal feeding operation that is permitted in the state, and that's everybody over 100 or 1,000 animal units, has to do that sampling and provide that to DEQ. So they have those records, and they're actually public records. So you do need to request that from them if you're going to do any business with them. Okay. All right. So let's kind of wrap up this achieving this organic value win. Here are some fields I would target. I'd look at my sandier soils first, or soils that have gone through a lot of heavy tillage over the year and you've burned up a lot of the organic matter. That would be the soils I would target first. Any fields that you see a problem with crusting over after rainfalls and higher runoff than you'd really expect, or higher runoff than my neighbor's fields, those might be the places I would target. And if when you poke that shovel into the ground and you see what's down below, you don't see earthworms, you don't see a lot of biological activity, those would be the fields I would also begin to target. Those are the fields that you'll get a benefit, hard to say the dollar value. And then I've had a number of farmers tell me that they like to target the fields that where they have problem drown out areas, ponding areas, because of that lack of infiltration, and using manure on those fields tends to make those areas disappear in a fairly short period of time. So those are the fields I would target for the organic value. Any comments or questions or thoughts? Okay. How are we doing on questions here? All right. The salts we haven't touched on. Compaction. So now we're starting to deal with some of those negative issues that we need to think in terms of. And I think that's where I want to wrap up with a few comments, is some of those negative concerns. Okay. So what would be those challenges of using manure? And salts, compaction were put up there. What else would you put up here? What do you think is the number one concern with getting manure from a neighbor animal feeding operation. Yeah. Thank you, Walt. Yes, odor, probably, right? What else would you put up here on the list? Weed seeds is a possibility, yep. Runoff, and I hope we answered the runoff question a little bit, because we expect with manured fields, you're gonna have less runoff, less erosion. But certainly runoff, it can be a negative, and here's where it can be a negative. If we allow the soil P levels to build over time by putting down more manure than we're using up the P, that runoff that does occur will be higher and higher in P, and that P is a problem for algae blooms in our local lakes and streams. So a lot of our livestock operations have those fields because they've been putting the manure on the same field. Hopefully, if you're a crop farmer, you're not up there in those 2, 3, 500 pounds parts per million phosphorus levels. You're down in that 20 range, and you're needing that phosphorus. But if you've got fields that are high in phosphorus, I would not want to put the manure there anyway. Okay. All right. Well, the other thing was the net return. What's the transportation cost? Let's see if we can't walk through a couple of those here. Okay, here's the three I came prepared on, and then we'll try to answer the rest. Okay, let's talk in terms of transportation cost. Now, you might think back to, well, let's just use the feedlot example. We said that value, I think, was let's see, what was it, 15 to 30? Was that 14 to 30? 14 to 28, okay. Now, these are numbers that I pull, that Dean Secchi's Secchi Agri-Services Group provides me. They do a lot of work with animal feeding operations also in terms of marketing manure. And their rate for application, their cost for application that they generally will point to is for when we're in that 20 to 25 ton per acre, common for feedlot manure, it's in the range of about $4 per ton to apply the manure. For poultry manure, we're typically in this 3 to 5, maybe to 7 ton per acre. So we're probably above $8 per ton to apply the manure. So let's say we started with $14 for that at the low end of the beef. We've got to subtract off, if we were doing the beef, we'd subtract off for that. So we'd be down to a $10 net value, a net return, just considering the application cost. Now there's also a transportation cost. How far are you from that feedlot? If I was 20 miles away, my cost is in the range of $6. All right. So take additional 6 off, and I'd be down to a net return of about $4 a ton for the nutrient value on the lower end. So I might be able to transport manure 20 miles with beef manure. You can do the same kind of calculation for poultry manure, and you'll find you can probably transport it even further than that. In fact, and I'm trying to remember the name of the gentleman that grows broilers for a Smart Chicken here east of Lincoln by Waverly. Yeah, Bevins. What's the first name? Bill Bevins. Thank you. My memory is going bad here. Bill Bevins told me that last spring that he's transporting manure out to Beaver Crossing area, which is about 40 miles away. And that crop farmer apparently feels like he's getting benefit because he's continuing to buy all of the manure. So we're seeing poultry manure going some pretty significant distances, at least the broiler litter. Probably not going to go that far with the beef cattle, but I think the radius that we're looking at today is far greater than it was even 5-10 years ago as we begin to recognize that nutrient value. So transportation ranges of 20 miles and under are very common any longer. But do that kind of math and see how far, what's your net return after you've taken that application cost and the transportation cost out of that. And those numbers should be good for right now. With the swine manure and the slurry manures, we probably are not going to transport them near as far. These are, again, numbers that have been shared with me by Sechi and then a survey that was done in Iowa State, and roughly the same ballpark. But using Sechi's numbers, if I was to transport that manure a mile, I'd be dealing with $20 per 1,000 gallons. And that was kind of the lower end of that range I gave you for the value of poultry or of swine manure. Was, I think it was $20 to $40. So we probably aren't going to transport our slurry manures with a lot of liquid more than just a few miles. But so keep those kind of costs as you're looking at what's the net return on those products. All right. Odor, probably our biggest challenge. If we're dealing with the slurry manure, there's only one way that I think you can deal with it and keep your neighbors happy, and that's get it injected directly into the soil at the very time that you're applying it. It's just too much of a nuisance otherwise to do anything else. And there's good equipment out there for getting it injected, for minimizing the loss of residue in the process, but just recognize that's what needs to be done. If we're dealing with a dry manure, I think you're probably not going to incorporate it. No, not much value in incorporating it. And so really the thing you want to look at is the weather conditions and recognize what conditions are likely going to cause the odors to stay near the ground and impact my neighbors. And so I encourage people to get access to some weather data. Tyler is really good to tell you, where would be the best place to get this. This is something I was suggested to me a couple of years ago by a spray pilots. And the thing I want to know are temperature and wind speed. And I'd like to know those at the same time. And I would like to identify what are those high risk conditions. And the two conditions that when these two combinations happen, then I'm concerned about impacting my neighbors. Stable or declining temperatures, and usually that's temperatures during the nighttime hours, early morning hours, and low wind speeds. Again, often nighttime and early morning hours. And so if I find wind speeds less than 5 miles per hour and stable wind conditions, then I would highlight those as high risk times. And let's say I was just looking at this period right here as a high risk time and I don't have this. I want to get the manure applied and drying out 24 hours prior to the beginning of this point. So that would mean applying it back on this day and then having good drying conditions in that the next day before this condition existed. So this is my high risk time. Now, I can also look at wind direction. In this time, that wind is forecast to be to the northeast or to the east. So I'd ask myself, are there neighbors to the northeast and east that I'm worried about? If there are, that risk is a high risk, that field is a high risk field for applying manure. If my neighbors are on a different side, I might be able to get by on applying that. But odors stay close to the ground where neighbors experience it when we have stable temperatures and we have very low wind speeds. That's the conditions we need to avoid. And we'd like a good 24 hours of drying time for our solid manures prior to that event happening. Okay. I think because of time, I'm not going to walk through it. There is some instructions in there in terms of how do you identify the value of the nitrogen, how you credit the value of the nitrogen. It's a pretty simple calculation. There's a fact sheet in there that will do it for you. So I'm not going to walk through it. And I think we want to answer a couple of additional questions. One was on salts. In eastern Nebraska here, we're generally in pretty good shape for dealing with salts. We have enough rainfall that tends to move those salts down through the soil. So even there are salts coming with the manures. But generally, it's been very rare that you find animal manures when applied at an agronomic rate that cause a salt-related issue. If maybe you're dealing with a soil that is sodic in nature already, and then you're adding some additional, maybe that would be the condition. But in most cases, salts are not an issue for animal manures. If you think you've got an individual situation that you're concerned about, you know, there's two properties. There's the salinity of the soil and well, I certainly watch the soil salinity in your soil testing, and there are ranges that you need to be aware of. I think for most crops, it's an EC of less than 2 is not a problem, if I remember right. And then there's the soil acidity, and there you're watching that ratio of sodium to things such as calcium and magnesium. If you have some individual questions, we can sit down and visit about that. But in general, because of the rainfall we have in this area, the leaching of salts moves anything through. We don't see that as commonly a problem. But if you have a situation you want to explore, let's talk about it after the meeting. Let's see, I want to skip this. Net return, I think we visited about that. Using the swine manure, did you have other questions that you want? Do you folks do manure testing? I think any soils lab that I've worked with does manure testing also. Yeah. Okay. Compaction was raised. Larry, I think you raised the compaction issue. That's one to always watch out for. We're using heavy equipment in most cases, especially these folks that are commercial transporters. You folks probably know the conditions you want to avoid. You want to avoid moist soil conditions when you're compacting that soil. Really, a day like today is ideal. Frozen soils is the best time to avoid it. I'm worried about runoff now of manure I apply this time of the year. So if I'm going to apply it this time of the year, I'm looking at fields that have the lowest risk of runoff when we have that melt in the spring. But this is a perfect time to avoid compaction. I don't know what to say other than you got to know that it's always going to be an issue. Right. So you're at their mercy many times. You know, I'd say always look for the lowest risk conditions if you have some fields that you can choose from. Try to get the driest conditions if you can. The drier soil conditions are your best. Yeah. If you've got high risk times, head to your sandy soils if you have any choices there. A very simple answer to a rather complex question. All right. Other things that we didn't answer. Differences in sources. Yes. Yeah, what about dairy? Prairie land dairy? Mm-hmm. Right. Is that another iteration? Mm-hmm. I would suggest that it's very similar to the compost products that we've talked about here today. You're going to see that very similar changes, improvements to soil characteristics. It behaves pretty much as a dry manure. You've lost most of the ammonium. You got all the phosphorus, all the potassium. You've got some organic nitrogen. One of the things I always worry a little bit about composted manures is they can actually be, during the early part of a growing season, they can actually consume some of that nitrogen in the soil. And so you may need a starter fertilizer. You may need to monitor nitrogen conditions in that soil during the early season to avoid that nitrogen consumption by the compost, is that organic material is breaking down and that soil is, you know, we've just excited all of those microbes in the soil by applying that compost, and they're all using nitrogen. They're consuming nitrogen for their processes. So watch the nitrogen status early in the season. Aaron, what would you add to that for compost? Yeah. Yep. Mhm. But an excellent source of phosphorus, excellent source of potassium, very limited odor, very little nuisance for your neighbors. So I would never discourage its use, but you do have to watch the nitrogen status of your crop, especially early in the season. Other questions? Yes. Say that again.
Tillage still recommended after application.
For our dry manures, typically I would say, I don't want you to do tillage. I want that residue on the surface, and I want the value of the no-till. If you are told you have to, or if you're sitting next to a neighbor that complains and you're trying to make them happy, then maybe I would consider incorporating that manure. Or I would go with as dry a manure as I could find. If I could get it from a broiler operation, very, very little odor. If I got solids that came out of a feedlot late summer after it's been dried all summer long, not generally much problem. I wouldn't want to go with wet solids or some of the egg-laying manures, the semi-solid manures, tremendous odor from some of those sources. So if I could get by without tillage, I think the benefits of the no-till are better, are more important to keep in mind. Swine manure, it will go a long ways. I think you'll find most of your dry manures, especially if it's dry, if you can get yourself a quarter-mile buffer, I don't think you're going to experience it. I always want you to try to get that good 24 hours from the finish of the applying period to when you ever have one of those high-risk periods. I'd like that to be good drying weather, lots of good sunshine. You're just trying to reduce your risk as much as you can. It's hard to ever predict, but that's the things you have control over. Other questions or thoughts? Yes. Mm-hmm. Okay. And so you're concerned about the uniformity of the application. And I think that is an excellent question to raise with anybody that is going to do that application for you. Equipment is getting better, but there's still a lot of it dependent upon the operator and how they do things. One of the things I would suggest you do, just to show them that you're keeping an eye on watching them, is I would, excuse me, sorry. Don't do that. I would put out some sheets of plastic of equal size in my field, maybe across their spread pattern, and maybe even some the length of their spread pattern, and see how uniform those are. I've used always a 22 square foot piece of plastic. And if you use that exact size, whatever falls on there in terms of pounds will be the application rate of tons per acre. So if I collect 10 pounds of manure on that 22 square foot piece of plastic, then I got an application rate of 10 ton per acre. Now I'd put multiple of these out and see, are those fairly uniform or is there a lot of variability? And if it's not up to what you think is reasonable for that operator, I'd get a different operator the next year. That's, I guess, as good of advice as I would have. But that's a problem with manure. Is one of the problems is uniformity of application. The other thing that I've seen done, and we're beginning to look at, and Charlie Wortman has been talking about this, is putting out a rate that maybe doesn't meet all of our nitrogen needs, And then think about these rigs that maybe even build sensors into looking at that crop and do a side dressing to top off the nitrogen need of the crop. And if we had the sensors in place, that would tell us, that would cover up some of that lack of uniformity that you might have run into on that manure application. I don't think we're seeing much of that done yet. In fact, we probably have some learning to do. But sensor-based application of nitrogen in combination with manure, I think has a very interesting future ahead of us to really gain the greatest value out of that manure. So I think that's a nice combination. Okay. They are. They do a better job of pulverizing that manure. So I do like them better. I still think most of your variability is in the driver in the cab. And he's the one I would keep an eye on rather than the equipment. But you can. Yeah. Are they overlapping the right amount? Are they trying to keep a consistent speed through the field? Now, some of the equipment is coming with, GPS and weigh scales that they can actually give you a map of the application rate through the whole field. May even ask for something like that. And commercial applicators, that would be a reasonable request. I've gone into your lunchtime. Tyler, I'm sorry I went too long, I think. But I thank you for all of the questions and for the conversation here. If you want to visit more about this, I'd be glad to. But I hope you find some places in your farm for using manure. I think there's a lot of value that we've not always credited. And I think it's important that we consider how we can use that in our local communities. Thank you.